Picture this, a corridor lit only by torches that spit and hiss against the damp stone walls. The smell of wax and sweat thick in the air. Somewhere behind you, the soft shuffle of bare feet trying not to echo. Yet every sound is swallowed by the silence ahead. Looms a door carved with golden lions, its surface polished by the trembling hands that have pushed against it before. On the other side waits a king not draped in robes of justice, but in hunger. The walls hold their breath, the servants avert their eyes. The night itself bends under the weight of what is about to happen. A girl, no older than 16, steps forward, her eyes wet, her body stiff, her silence deafening, and history will not remember her name. The kingdom called itself Eternal High Walls rose against the horizon, as if they could block the winds of time itself. Stone fortresses crowned the hills, their banners heavy with embroidered suns and lions, their meaning not protection, but dominion. The streets below swelled with life merchants. Priests, soldiers, slaves, all moving in a rhythm dictated by the throne. Every sound in that city carried the same echo. The king decides. The ruler was no ordinary monarch to his people. He was both man and more than man. His bloodline declared divine. His word pronounced as law and prophecy together. In the palace he was father to all outside it. He was shepherd of souls. But in the chambers hidden behind veils, he was something far darker. The rituals began quietly. They were not written into scripture. They were not sung in hymns. They were whispered into being through the mouths of advisors who knew how to clothe lust in the robes of tradition. It was said the kingdom could only remain pure if the king himself partook of purity, that the bloodline of rulers was to be cleansed again and again by untouched innocence. To question this was treason. Priests nodded their approval. Courtiers bowed their heads. Fathers brought daughters and lowered their eyes. Imagine standing in such a world, every temple. Bell ringing not as prayer, but as reminder of obedience. Every sermon warning not of sin, but of disloyalty. Every guard at the gates, a silent reminder that the body of your child belonged first to the crown. The palace corridors became a hunting ground, though no soldier raised a blade. Messengers carried lists through villages, noting the names of girls untouched, unwed, unseen by outsiders. Mothers wept in secret, knowing silence was their only shield. Fathers prayed for storms or sickness, anything that might hide their daughters from selection. The air in those homes was heavy with dread meals eaten in whispers, daughters wrapped in scarves, not to display modesty, but to conceal beauty. And still the palace found them. The king was convinced this. Ritual fed his power, that by gathering purity, he could drain it like water from a spring and live forever in strength and authority. It was not desire alone, it was obsession. Obsession twisted into doctrine. Psychologists today might call it compulsion. A hunger rooted in fear of decline, of weakness, of mortality. But in that kingdom no such words existed. There was only the king's will. Those around him learned to survive by agreeing. Priests crafted blessings to cloak the ritual in sanctity. Generals justified it as strengthening the crown. Scribes omitted the cries of the girls. From history, power protects itself not with swords alone, but with silence. The cruelty to come was not a sudden storm. It was a structure, a palace built on obedience, fear, and ritualized violation. And in this kingdom, the bed of the king was not a place of rest. It was a weapon. What followed would not merely break hearts, it would shatter generations. The ritual did not announce itself with drums or banners. It came quietly, like a disease moving from house to house, carried not by soldiers with drawn swords, but by officials with scrolls and silent guards who waited at the door. A name would be spoken, a family would bow their heads, and the room itself would collapse into suffocating silence. The girl chosen was never asked. Her will never considered, her fate already sealed in the ink on parchment picture. A village at dusk, the smell of cooking fires drifting through narrow lanes, the hum of insects in the fields. And then the knock on the door. Every family knew what that knock meant. The torch outside flickered against the mud walls. Mothers gripped the arms of their daughters. Fathers stared at the ground as if the earth could swallow them whole. Inside the houses, the air thickened with fear. Every object seemed to hold its breath. Bowls of food left untouched, lamps burning low. The officer would unfold the scroll, his voice steady, unbroken. He did not look at the girl. He read her name as though reciting. An item to be collected, grain tribute livestock. The silence after the name was always the same, sharp as a blade. Some girls wept openly, some stood frozen, some tried to cling to their mother's sleeves until the guards pried them away. One child barely. 13 cried out a single word, over and over the word for home, until her voice cracked into silence. But home could not protect her. The families who resisted, even in whispers, were marked as disloyal. The punishment was swift men dragged into prisons. Women beaten into silence sometimes, whole households vanished, leaving only shuttered windows and unanswered questions. And so obedience was carved into the bones of the people. Imagine being that girl, walking through the village path at night. A torch. In front of you, soldiers at your side, your neighbors turning away, not from shame, but from survival. The air smelled of dust and sweat. The gravel beneath your feet, grinding like chains, every step, carrying you closer to the palace gates that swallowed innocence and returned only silence. The selection was not random. Advisors sought girls described as untouched, pale as ivory, dark as onyx, graceful as swans, timid as lambs. Each comparison, not a compliment, but a judgment of worth. The king's hunger demanded variety, novelty, and so the scrolls filled with names from every region, every class, every corner of the kingdom. No one was safe. Families prayed for sickness to strike their daughters, prayed for scars, prayed for any blemish that might render them invisible, but health was cursed, beauty was punished, and even those who hid were eventually found. The ritual did not end when the girl stepped into the palace. It began there. Inside vast halls lit by golden lamps, the chosen were gathered rows. Of them seated in silence, their faces reflecting the glow of oil flames, shadows dancing across frightened eyes. Silk was draped across them, as though cloth could erase terror, as though adornment could disguise captivity. The priests entered to bless them, intoning prayers that twisted scripture into justification. Purity, they said, was the crown's right. Purity was the kingdom's shield. Purity was the path to eternity. The words washed over the girls like cold water. None of them believed yet. None of them could refuse. One girl sat perfectly still, her hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles bled small drops of red, staining the silk she wore. She did not move, she did not speak, only her trembling betrayed her. Another whispered to herself, not a prayer, but a memory, repeating her mother's lullaby under her breath, a desperate tether to a world already slipping away. And the guards stood watching. Silent stone faced their armor, gleaming under torchlight, their humanity buried beneath. Duty, each girl was eventually led down corridors where the air grew colder, where voices fell away, where doors closed with a sound heavier than thunder. What awaited them was not devotion. It was domination. Not sanctity, but seizure. The ritual of selection was not simply the choosing of bodies. It was the breaking of spirits, the kingdom's way of teaching its people that resistance was impossible, that innocence belonged not to the child, not to the family, but to the king. The ritual did not end when the night did. It echoed in the empty beds of villages, in the silent tears of mothers, in the vacant gazes of fathers who knew their bloodline had been stolen by decree. The cruelty was not one night, it was a cycle, a machine turning endlessly fueled by fear and silence. And every girl who walked those corridors carried not only her own terror, but the unspoken dread of an entire people. The ritual of selection was not about purity at all. It was about power, and power always demands silence. The chamber was a world apart. It was not simply a room. It was a stage carefully constructed to blur the line between luxury and terror. Velvet curtains hung thick against the walls, smothering sound, their folds heavy with the scent of dust and incense golden. Lamps burned with perfumed oil, the smoke curling in the air until breathing itself felt like swallowing flowers and ash. The bed stood in the center, raised on a dais, its frame carved with lions and serpents, its sheets woven of silk so smooth they seemed to glow under the firelight. To an outsider, it might have looked like paradise. To the girls, it was a cage without bars. Imagine stepping inside. The first breath you take is not freedom. It is suffocation. The perfume clinging to your throat, the heat pressing against your skin, the silence around you more terrifying than any scream. The king waited there, his figure draped in robes too heavy for the warmth of the chamber, his crown discarded on a table near the wine goblets, as though even the symbol of rule was not required here. Here power spoke not through laws, not through armies, but through the body of one man claiming the bodies of others. The ritual was always the same. The girl was brought forward, her steps hesitant, the echo of her bare feet against marble louder than her trembling voice. She was told to kneel. Sometimes she obeyed in silence. Sometimes she resisted with tears, but resistance never mattered. The chamber had its own laws. Guards remained at the door, but they did not turn away. They stood as statues, eyes fixed on nothing, ears trained to hear everything, their presence a reminder that even within the privacy of silk and velvet, she was never truly alone. The king spoke little. When he did, his words were soft, deliberate, measured, not the roar of a monarch, but the murmur of a man convinced of his own divinity. He called it purification, renewal, sacrifice. But each word was a mask stretched thin over obsession. Psychologically, it was compulsion repeating itself. Night after night, a ritual designed less for desire than for reassurance. Reassurance that he was still strong, still feared, still eternal. For him, the trembling of the girl was proof of his power. For her, the trembling was the last thing she could not control. The air inside that room grew hotter with every passing moment, the oil lamps sputtering the scent of roses, mixing with the acrid smoke of charred wicks. Every sense was trapped. The velvet swallowed sound, so that a stifled cry vanished. Into the fabric, the silks beneath her body clung with unnatural coolness. Her skin prickled with fear, her breath shallow, as if the air itself had turned against her. No clock marked the time. For some, the night felt endless. For others, it disappeared into a haze of shock and numbness. But always the door eventually opened again. The guards led her away, and the chamber awaited its next offering. And outside in the corridors, another girl waited in silence, hearing nothing, seeing nothing, only smelling the faint trace of incense leaking from beneath the door. The chamber was not a place of intimacy, it was a factory of fear. Each ritual identical, each act designed not for pleasure, but for repetition, a cycle of cruelty, polished smooth by habit. It was obsession disguised as tradition, cruelty disguised as sanctity, immortality disguised as love. And yet, the chamber itself remembered, the silks stained with tears, the curtains heavy with silence, the bed groaning under the weight of generations of stolen innocence. Even when the lamps were extinguished and the king slept, the room itself seemed to breathe, carrying with it the echo of muffled cries that no priest would ever write and no chronicle would ever preserve. This was not devotion, it was control, and the control was absolute. When the chamber door finally opened, the ritual was not finished. It only changed shape. The girl emerged not with chains around her wrists, but with something far heavier: silence. She walked unsteadily, her eyes unfocused, her body trembling, the silk draped over her shoulders, now feeling less like cloth and more like a shroud. No one spoke to her, not the guards, not the servants, not even the priests who had once blessed her arrival. Her name was still hers, but her life was no longer. She was returned to her family, or sometimes left in a separate wing of the palace, a shadow among shadows. For the families there was no celebration, only shame. Mothers embraced their daughters in the quiet of night, pressing, trembling lips against their hair, whispering prayers, not of gratitude, but of survival. Fathers turned away, unable to look at what they could not protect, their silence, heavier than any curse. Neighbors did not ask what had happened, they already knew. The walls of the palace had no need for messengers. Its cruelty traveled faster than words. The girls who returned were different. Some stared endlessly at the floor, as if afraid that lifting their eyes would invite the gaze of the king again. Some did not speak at all, their voices lost in the chamber, their throats carrying only silence. One girl rocked herself back and forth in the corner of her house, repeating a lullaby meant for infants, as if the rhythm could shield her from memories that clung like smoke. Another refused to eat, touching no food that passed before her lips until her body itself began to vanish, piece by piece. Society gave them no refuge. The whispers followed them like shadows. Purity taken meant impurity forever. Mothers of sons avoided them. Brides were chosen from other houses. Dowries doubled, as if to compensate for unseen scars. The cruelty extended beyond the night, it stretched into lifetimes. And yet these girls were never spoken of in records. Scribes erased them as if they were footnotes unworthy of ink, as if by silence the shame could be erased from history. But the silence was the weapon. Fear taught obedience more effectively than swords could ever do. Every family who saw their daughter chosen learned to bow deeper. Every father who could not resist learned to keep his tongue still. Every village that watched a girl taken at dusk learned never to speak against the throne. The king did not need to patrol the streets with armies. His power reached into kitchens, bedrooms, cradles. It fed on the hush of mothers. It grew strong in the stares of fathers who dared not meet the eyes of their children. Imagine standing in such a place. The smell of bread baking in the morning mingled with the unspoken memory of loss. The laughter of children hollow, because every mother feared which laughter would one day be silenced. The consequence was not only personal, it was political. The ritual turned the body of each girl into a warning. Each family broken became a pillar holding up the throne. Each silence became another stone in the palace. Wall obedience was no longer a choice. It was survival, and survival meant forgetting. Forgetting the face of the child who once sang in the courtyard. Forgetting the warmth of her presence at the table. Forgetting her laughter carried on the wind. But history does not forget. What followed would reveal that even silence has an echo, and sometimes the echo becomes too loud to contain. The kingdom believed the ritual would never end. Night after night, the chamber consumed innocence and returned silence, the cycle unbroken, the throne untouched. But cycles crack, even stone wears thin. It began with a single girl. She was not the youngest nor the fairest she carried. No titles, her family was poor, her village far from the palace walls, and yet she carried something the king did not expect: defiance. When the guards led her through the corridors, her steps did not falter. She did not lower her gaze. She fixed her eyes forward, as if staring into the very heart of the palace itself. Inside the chamber, the air was heavy as always. Incense, roses, smoke, velvet curtains swallowing sound. The king waited, expecting the trembling, the tears, the silence. But when he spoke, she did not kneel. The guards shifted uneasily, their hands brushing the hilts of their blades, but she remained standing, her breath quick, her body rigid, her silence not fear but refusal. The king's eyes narrowed. He rose slowly, the silk of his robe whispering against the marble, his shadow stretching long across the chamber until it fell upon her face. Still, she did not bend. The silence in that moment was sharper than steel, and then she spoke a single sentence, her voice shaking yet clear. She told him that his bed would one day devour him, that every girl he had broken would rise in silence against him, that his immortality was a lie carved only in the bodies of children. The words struck like thunder. For a moment the chamber itself seemed to recoil, the lamps flickering, the smoke twisting as though the very air had grown restless. The king's face darkened, rage swelling like a storm. He raised his hand as if to strike her down, but something deeper than anger flickered in his eyes, fear, because in her defiance he glimpsed the truth. His power was not eternal, it was fragile. It lived only because silence protected it, and silence had just been broken. The girl was dragged away, her fate never written. Some say she was executed, some say she vanished into the night, carried away by sympathetic hands. Some say her voice lingered long after her body was gone. But the echo of her defiance spread. Servants whispered of her words in kitchens. Soldiers repeated them under their breath at campfires. Mothers taught them as lullabies cloaked in song. Fathers whispered them into the ears of sons as warnings and as hope. The ritual continued, but something had shifted. The air in the villages was heavier, but no longer only with fear. It was heavy with something dangerous: memory. The king still summoned girls, his chamber still devoured them, but behind closed doors, families began to resist in small ways. Daughters hidden deeper, neighbors watching the roads together, priests hesitating before blessings. The cracks in silence widened. The climax was not a single night of rebellion. It was the slow dawning of inevitability, that no throne fed on terror could last forever. The king did not see it at first, blinded by the glow of his chamber's lamps, but history would mark this moment as the beginning of his unraveling. One voice had been enough to turn silence into a weapon, no longer for him, but against him. The cruelty had reached its height, and now collapse had begun. When the king finally aged, the ritual did not stop at once. For years he clung to the cycle, even as his body weakened, even as his breath rattled. Like dry leaves in winter, still he demanded innocence, as though purity could stitch together his crumbling flesh. But no ritual conquers time. The chamber lamps eventually burned low. The curtains sagged, the perfumes lost their strength, and what had once seemed eternal collapsed into decay. The kingdom outlived him, yet his shadow lingered, not in stone monuments or triumphs of war, but in the silence of those whose names had never been recorded. Generations bore the scars, families learned to hide their daughters not only from kings, but from memory itself. Mothers teaching their children that beauty was dangerous, that silence was safety, that obedience was survival. Songs were altered stories, rewritten, lineages blurred as if to erase what had been taken, but absence became its own kind of monument. Even when the throne passed to others, even when new rulers declared new laws, the echo remained. The people remembered the knock on the door at dusk, the torchlight against mud walls the way. Neighbors looked away when names were read aloud. That memory carved itself into the culture. Marriage rituals changed. Girls married younger, whispers of protection hidden in tradition. Parents teaching children never to draw attention to themselves, never to shine too brightly, never to invite the gaze of power. The cruelty of one man became a shadow cast across centuries. History itself tried to bury it. Scribes omitted it. Chronicles painted the king as a great ruler, as a divine figure, as one who fed the empire with strength and stability. But beneath the ink, silence lived, and silence carried truth, more enduring than any scripture. Imagine standing among the ruins of that palace. Now the stones cracked, the banners long vanished, the corridors filled only with dust and wind. Yet if you listen closely, you can still hear it. Not the roar of armies, not the chant of priests, but the faint, unbroken whisper of girls who never chose, who never spoke, whose silence became the strongest voice of all. The legacy was not glory, it was grief. And grief has a way of traveling across generations, embedding itself in lullabies, prayers, glances between parents and children. The cruelty did not end with the man who enforced it. It endured because silence endured. And Yet the very silence that once protected him became the silence that exposed him, because the walls remember even when history forgets. The torches are long extinguished, and the silks have turned to dust. Yet the silence of those chambers lingers, like a breath caught in stone. What was once ritual has become memory, unwritten, unspoken, but never erased. Generations pass, rulers change, dynasties crumble. Still, in the quiet corridors of history, the shadows remain. Mothers who lost daughters, families broken in silence, and a people taught to bow their heads, all left behind fragments of a truth too dangerous to be told aloud. We search the records and find little. We look at portraits and see only pride. But beneath the paint, beneath the marble, lies a darker inheritance, the reminder that power built on suffering never disappears. It seeps into the very foundations of a nation. And so we end where we began, in silence. Because sometimes the past does not rest. The walls remember even when history forgets.